Welcome to Creepy Vibes. Tonight we're plunging into the darkest corners of New York City, where the tales of 5 most terrifying police encounters will make your skin crawl. But before we begin, let me warn you. Most viewers make one huge mistake. They leave without subscribing. And because of that, they miss the most chilling stories that only true horror fans dare to hear. If you don't want to miss the tales that keep even the toughest cops awake at night, hit that subscribe button now. Because what I'm about to reveal is only the beginning, and the darkness has so much more to unveil. And tell me, where are you watching from? And what time is it there? Because here, it's always night, and the shadows are never quiet. The NYPD's 27th precinct had been around since the 1920s, an old stone building squatting between 2 upscale apartment complexes like a forgotten relic. It wore decades of grime like a second skin, the limestone chipped and scarred from years of neglect. Detective Officer Vega hated pulling the night shift. He always said it felt like the building itself was watching him, its corridors breathing slow and heavy in the dark. No matter how many layers of cheap paint they slapped on the walls, the place always smelled faintly of rot. Mold, maybe. Or something deeper, something the pipes choked down but never fully digested. Marcus was a man who'd seen too much in his 20 years on the force. But nothing rattled him like that building did. It started with the whispers. He'd be working, alone, typing up a case report in the bullpen around 2 or 3 in the morning when a voice, hoarse, childlike, would murmur his name. Marcus. He'd snap his head up, eyes scouring the room. But there was nothing. Just the empty desks, shadows pooled like dark ink beneath them. The old fluorescent lights overhead flickered and buzzed, their glow thin and sickly. After the 3rd or 4th time, he started hearing the voice during the day too. A faint giggle threading through the precinct's white noise like a child playing hide and seek. Marcus kept it to himself. Who the hell would he tell? The department shrink? His wife? She'd already been looking at him like he was a grenade with the pin half pulled. But then Delgado found him. It was a Friday night, the kind where the rain came down so thick it felt like the city was being scrubbed raw. Marcus had gone missing, from his desk. Delgado tracked him down after half an hour, standing motionless in front of cell 3, his face pale and his eyes glazed over. "What the hell you doing, man?" Delgado asked, shaking him by the shoulder. His grip was strong, the way you grab someone standing too close to the edge of a rooftop. I heard a kid. Sounded like she was crying." Delgado's brow furrowed. "In there?" Cell 3 hadn't been used in years. Budget cuts and paperwork had seen to that. It was just rusted iron bars and dust. But when Delgado unlocked it, they found something scratched into the back wall, hidden beneath years of grime. A name. Amelia. Delgado's mouth tightened. "Don't mess with that shit, man. You heard about the rookie who blew his brains out in here back in the 80s, right? Same damn cell." Marcus nodded absently, eyes still locked on the scrawled name. He felt the air around him grow thick, sticky, like breathing through syrup. He didn't leave it alone. Couldn't. Over the next few weeks, the whispers grew louder, clearer. A girl's voice, always just out of reach. And not just calling his name now, no, she was telling him things. Things about cases he was working, things he shouldn't have known. Murder weapons, locations of bodies. He started writing them down, scrawling frantically on legal pads until his fingers cramped, and damned if the tips weren't real. They solved 4 cases off the girl's hints. Delgado called it coincidence. "You're burning out, man," he warned, lips tight over a cigarette. "You're heading for a breakdown." But Marcus had never felt more alive, or more terrified. Because he knew deep down the voice was real, and that it wanted something. Then they found her, Amelia Rodriguez, age 7, abducted from her Brooklyn home in 1976. The case was never closed. Her remains were discovered in the basement of an old apartment building, one bulldozed decades ago to build the very precinct where Marcus now worked. The remains were barely bones, tangled in rotted fabric. The forensic team found her name, stitched inside the hem of her dress. Her death was ruled a homicide, another unsolved case for the files. Marcus had sat in his car that night, fingers trembling against the steering wheel. The voice had gone silent. For the first time in weeks, the precinct was just a building again, brick and mortar, cold and indifferent. He thought it was over, but then came the scream. It tore through the precinct like a knife through canvas, shredding the air, echoing down the corridors until the walls themselves seemed to quake. Marcus shot up from his desk, heart hammering. Delgado nearly bowled him over, his eyes wide and terrified. They ran to cell 3, Delgado muttering prayers under his breath. The air was freezing, thick with a smell like rotting flowers. The word liar was scratched into the wall, the metal twisted like it had been ripped by claws. Fresh flakes of rust lay scattered on the floor like blood. Marcus left the force 2 days later, moved upstate to a house by a lake, bought a dog, stopped talking about the voices. Delgado tried to keep in touch, but Marcus's phone would only ring 3 times before cutting off, like something was intercepting the calls. 6 months later, Delgado got the news. Marcus Vega dead by his own hand. Pills, whiskey, and a note left on the kitchen table. One word scribbled in a trembling hand. Amelia. But that wasn't the worst of it. The state trooper who found Marcus's body swore he heard a little girl's voice whispering from the darkened corner of the room, calling his name, just like Marcus had heard all those months ago. Ray Jenkins never believed in ghost stories. As a beat cop in Brooklyn for nearly a decade, he'd seen enough real horror to laugh off tales of restless spirits and cursed places. He wore his cynicism like armor, a shield against the madness that seeped into the city's bones. But the park had its legends. Prospect Park sprawled like a patchwork quilt of nature and nightmare, its twisting paths and shadowed groves hiding everything from lovers' trysts to the occasional overdose. It was a place that kept its secrets well, and every city cop knew. If you drew the night shift in the park, you were bound to see something that didn't sit right. They called her the Lady of Prospect Park. The stories went back decades. A woman in white, drifting along the fog-shrouded paths at dusk, her dress trailing in the dirt like a bridal train. Some said she was a bride left at the altar, driven mad by betrayal before throwing herself into the lake. Others claimed she was the victim of a robbery gone wrong, murdered beneath the oaks and left to rot among the roots. Ray had rolled his eyes the first time he'd heard the tale, dismissing it as just another urban legend born from boredom and booze. But everything changed the night he found the body. The call came in just before midnight. A jogger had stumbled across something near the lake, half buried beneath leaves and mud. Ray was the first on scene. The woman was in her mid-30s, her throat slashed so deep it nearly severed her head. Her skin was pale, the blood already crusted to a sticky blackness. But what chilled Ray most was the dress, a filthy, torn wedding gown. Her face was twisted in terror, eyes frozen wide and staring at something Ray couldn't see. For a moment, as he stood there with his flashlight trembling in his grip, he thought he could feel her terror echoing in the air, the weight of it pressing down on him like something wet and heavy. They never found her killer. No motive, no suspects. Just another unsolved murder added to the heap. Ray told himself he was fine, that he could shake it off. But something about her stayed with him, clung to his mind like frostbite. He drew the night patrol around the park 3 more times over the next year. And every time he saw her, always at a distance, a woman in white, trailing her dress through the mud, her steps soundless. He'd catch glimpses of her between the trees, her form blurred by mist or shadow. But whenever he called out, she would melt into the darkness, her shape dissipating like smoke. The other cops laughed it off, said he was just rattled, that he needed to take a vacation, drink himself numb in some beach town where the air was too warm and sweet for ghosts. But Ray couldn't shake it, couldn't let it go. And when he saw her again, late on a rain-slicked October night, he did something he'd promised himself he wouldn't. He followed her. His flashlight cut the air, the beam trembling as he crept through the trees. The ground was wet and soft, the mud sucking at his boots. His breath misted in front of him, each exhale a shuddering rasp. The woman glided ahead, her back to him, moving with a grace that seemed unnatural, fluid. Her dress trailed along the ground like an extension of her own body. "Ma'am, hey," Ray called, voice cracking. The darkness swallowed his words, his voice sounding small and frightened. She stopped. The sound of Ray's heartbeat thundered in his ears. He raised his flashlight, his fingers twitching against the plastic. Slowly, the woman's head twisted around, farther than it should have. The movement was unnatural, boneless, like the neck of a broken doll. Her face was a ruin, eyes sunken and shriveled, their whites streaked with threads of black. Lips curled back over rotted teeth. The skin around her mouth was split, jagged tears exposing raw, glistening tissue. Ray stumbled backward, his feet tangling in the underbrush. His flashlight flickered and died. Her scream tore through the air, a sound that made his bones rattle, that hollowed out his insides and left him gasping. They found him hours later, wandering the park's edge, mumbling to himself like a lunatic. His eyes were glassy, his cheeks wet with tears. Ray couldn't remember how he'd gotten there. Couldn't remember anything except her face, twisting toward him in the dark. He quit the force 2 weeks later, moved to the Bronx, got himself a job as a security guard in a department store. A nothing job for a man who wanted nothing more than to forget. But the city wouldn't let him go, because she followed him. No matter how far he ran, he kept seeing her. On the subway, her reflection shimmering in the scratched glass of the train doors. Through rain-streaked windows, her pale face staring out from darkened alleys. Reflected in mirrors, just over his shoulder, her mouth twisted into something between a smile and a snarl, always wearing that tattered wedding dress. Last anyone heard, Ray had checked himself into a psychiatric hospital upstate, the kind of place where they kept the lights on all night, where the windows were thick glass and the pills came in tiny paper cups. But even there, he couldn't escape her. Because some nights the other patients would wake to the sound of Ray's voice screaming her name into the darkness, and they swore, those that were awake to hear it, that a woman's voice would answer. The call came in at 3:14 a.m., screaming, muffled and distorted. Sounded like it was funneled through a tunnel a mile long. Dispatch nearly dismissed it as a prank, but something in the dispatcher's voice caught Detective Samuel's attention. A note of genuine fear, the kind they're trained to mask. An old tenement on the Lower East Side, the kind of place crumbling under the weight of its own history. 6 stories of cracked brick and broken dreams, windows fogged with years of grime. Most of the tenants were poor, elderly or worse, forgotten. Samuels and Officer Ruiz rolled up in the dead of night, the air thick with that piss and garbage stench the city wears like cheap cologne. They climbed the stairs, boots echoing on, splintered wood, the wallpaper curling away from the walls like rotted skin. They found apartment 6B by the end of the hallway, the door slightly ajar. Someone's idea of a joke? Ruiz muttered, his voice tight. But Samuels was already pushing the door open, his flashlight carving slashes through the darkness. The apartment was empty. Furniture sat like sad, sagging skeletons, their cushions torn and bleeding stuffing. Dust coated everything, a heavy, choking layer that made their eyes itch. The wallpaper, mustard yellow and floral from some distant decade, peeled in jagged strips. The air felt wrong, coppery, sickening. The blood was in the kitchen, not splattered or pooled, but smeared, swirled in strange, looping patterns across the cracked linoleum. Samuels bent down, eyes narrowing. The symbols made no sense, twisting shapes like children's scribbles, but darker, meaner. Jesus, Ruiz whispered, backing away. Whoever made that call? There's no one here, Samuels said, his voice flat. It was a fact, sure as gravity. No body, no sign of struggle, just a hollow, empty silence thick enough to make their ears ring. They searched the entire building, knocked on every door. The tenants opened up reluctantly, eyes bleary, faces pale and drawn. "You hear anything tonight?" Samuels asked an old woman on the fourth floor. Her hair hung in wispy strands around her sunken cheeks. "Nothing," she said. "Nothing at all." And then, softer. "This building's always been quiet. Too quiet." It was the same story, door after door. People shaking their heads, eyes darting toward the stairwell like they expected something to come crawling up from below. They left the tenement a little before dawn, the sky bleeding purple over the rooftops. Samuels couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Days later, the calls started, always from the same number, an old landline disconnected years ago when the phone company gutted the building's wiring. It shouldn't have been possible. But the calls kept coming. Every time he answered, he heard the same thing, a woman's laughter, soft and wet, like someone gurgling through blood. He told Ruiz about it once, after a few drinks down at O'Malley's. But Ruiz just shook his head, eyes flicking toward the exit like he couldn't wait to get out. "Maybe you need some time off, Samuels," Ruiz said, his voice brittle. "This city, man, it gets into your head." But Ruiz started getting the calls too. At first, he laughed it off. A prank, he said. Someone messing with them. Maybe some lunatic who'd heard about the case. But then Samuels showed up at his door one night, eyes wild, hands trembling. "They're in the walls, Ruiz. I hear them whispering." Ruiz didn't let him inside. Couldn't. There was something in Samuel's voice, something broken and raw. He closed the door and locked it, feeling shame heat his face. Samuel's body was found in the tenement's basement 2 weeks later, hanged from an old steam pipe, his neck bruised and swollen, eyes fixed on nothing. The official report said suicide. The brass closed the file, added his name to the department's list of casualties claimed by stress and despair. But Ruiz knew better, because he'd been the one to cut Samuels down, and he'd seen the marks carved into Samuel's skin, tiny, spidery words scratched deep enough to draw blood, winding across his arms and chest like tangled vines. One word, repeated over and over, "Listen." Ruiz quit the force a week later, tried to drown the memory in cheap liquor and cheaper company, but the calls kept coming. Sometimes he could hear the woman laughing. Sometimes he could hear Samuel's, his voice cracked and splintered, begging Ruiz to come back. But worst of all were the whispers, those low, slithering voices that wormed their way through the receiver like rot. He started sleeping with the phone unplugged, threw it out eventually. But it didn't matter, because he could still hear them at night in the walls. The Midtown Diner had been a cop favorite for decades. Nestled between a pawn shop and a laundromat that hadn't updated its machines since the 70s, it was the kind of place that reeked of burnt coffee and old grease. But the boys in blue liked it well enough. Cheap food, hot coffee, and Mabel. Mabel had been working the graveyard shift since most of the precinct's rookies were still in diapers. Short, thick-waisted, her hair a dull silver that frizzed around her head like static. They joked she'd been there since the city was built, slinging eggs and pie to the beat cops of a dozen different mayors. The place had character, at least, until the remodel in '99. They tore out the linoleum floors and replaced them with cheap tile, slapped a coat of sterile white paint over the nicotine-stained walls. Even the booths were swapped out for stiff modern things that looked like they belonged in a fast food joint. Mabel didn't like it, said they were scraping the soul off the place. Patrolman Howard Klein agreed. He'd been hitting the diner for his post-shift cherry pie and black coffee ritual since his rookie year. Something about the place always felt like home, that warm bubble of familiarity that dulled the edges of a rough night. It was almost 2 a.m. when Klein walked in, his uniform wrinkled, eyes ringed with exhaustion. The rain outside had turned the city streets into a glistening snarl of puddles and broken glass. He slid into his usual booth and nodded to Mabel. She shuffled over, the bones in her wrist popping as she poured his coffee. "Rough night, sugar?" she asked. "Aren't they all?" Klein replied. She smiled, but it looked strained. like something was gnawing at her from the inside. But before he could ask, she hobbled away, her orthopedic shoes squeaking against the tile. The diner was nearly empty. Just him and Mabel, the jukebox broken and hissing static like a dead man's breath. Klein lifted his mug to his lips, eyes scanning the diner with the automatic caution of a cop. That's when he saw him, the man sitting in the far corner booth. Klein hadn't noticed him when he walked in, but there he was, clear as day. A guy, in old-fashioned clothes, gray suit, the kind you'd see in black and white photos from the 50s. His skin was pale and waxy, the color of cheap candle wax. The man's eyes were fixed on Klein, empty, flat like dirty glass. "Hey," Klein called out. "You good, buddy?" No answer. The man just stared, unblinking. His mouth moved, but no sound came out. Klein stood up, his pulse a tight drumbeat in his throat. His boots thudded against the tile as he approached the booth. But the man was gone. No door creak, no shuffle of feet. Just gone. Klein scanned the diner, every corner, even ducking into the restroom, but nothing. Just the wet echo of his own breath. "Mabel, you see that guy?" Klein asked, his voice thinner than he liked. "What guy?" Mabel asked, but her eyes slid away, her fingers trembling as she poured another pot of coffee. He didn't push it, but the feeling didn't leave him. It happened, again the next night, and the one after that. The same man, always in the far corner booth, staring. And every time Klein approached, he was gone. Like the air had swallowed him whole. He mentioned it to a couple of the other guys on the force. They laughed it off at first, but their expressions turned sour when he described the man. "Hell, Klein, I've seen him too," Rodriguez admitted one night, his eyes bloodshot and sunken. "Same booth, like he's waiting for something." Over the next few months, the sightings spread like a virus. Cops who swore they'd never believed in anything more than booze and bad luck started whispering about the man in the corner booth. Always watching, never speaking, Klein couldn't let it go. He finally asked Mabel about it on one of those nights when the diner felt like a mausoleum. His hands were shaking as he lifted his mug, the coffee sloshing over the rim. Mabel, who the hell is that guy? The one everyone keeps seeing in the corner booth? For a moment, she looked like she might cry. Her lip trembled, her eyes wet and distant. "You're not the first to see him," she said, voice like gravel. "And you won't be the last. That booth? They found a body there back in '74. Man had been dead for days before anyone noticed. Shot through the head. Cold case, no one ever figured out who did it or why." She leaned in, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Ever since then, people see him. Mostly cops. Like he's got some grudge against your kind. Or maybe he's just waiting for someone to listen." Klein stopped going to the diner after that. Tried to pretend it was just a coincidence. Some trick his mind had cooked up after too many double shifts and not enough sleep. Mabel retired a few months later. The diner limped along without her, losing regulars like teeth from a rotting jaw. But the stories kept coming. New officers with fresh faces and steady hands swore they saw him. And the corner booth, it's still there, empty, waiting. They say if you sit in it, you can feel a coldness seep into your bones. The kind of chill that no amount of coffee can burn away. And if you listen, real careful, you might just hear him. The man in the gray suit, asking for something you can't give him. NYPD officer Terrence Cole was used to weird calls. After 7 years on the force, he'd seen his share of the city's madness. Junkies clawing at their own skin like something was trying to get out. Homeless men who swore they were being stalked by shadows. Teenagers babbling about monsters in the alleys. New York had its ghosts. But nothing like this. The call came in at 2:30 a.m. A woman's scream, shrill and echoing, slicing through the tunnels of the 3 train like a rusty knife. Terrence arrived at the 148th Street station with 2 other officers, the fluorescent lights above buzzing like trapped insects. The place was nearly deserted, just the shuffling homeless and the occasional drunk weaving their way to God knows where. The conductor who called it in was pale, his hands shaking as he gestured down the tunnel. Heard it plain as day, Twice. Ain't never heard nothing like it. Thought someone was getting murdered, man, but when they checked the train, there was nothing. No signs of struggle. No blood. Just a faint, sour smell clinging to the air. Like rot. The surveillance footage was no help either. Just static and shadows. The kind of murky interference that made the tech guys shrug and blame bad wiring. For the next few weeks, the reports trickled in. Then they poured. Passengers swearing they heard a woman shrieking from somewhere in the dark, her voice jagged and wet, like her throat had been torn to ribbons. Conductors reported the screams echoing through the tunnels, chasing their trains like a vengeful ghost. But whenever the cops showed up, there was only silence, the sort of quiet that felt heavy, pressing down on your shoulders like a dead man's hand. Terrence became obsessed. He started riding the 3 train every night after his shift, his eyes burning from lack of sleep, nerves frayed and snapping. He brought a recorder with him, a cheap little thing he'd bought from a pawn shop on 125th. Nothing but white noise, his partner Ramirez said, eyebrows scrunched with worry. You gotta let this shit go, Cole. You're starting to look like one of those lunatics they drag out of the tunnels. But Terrence couldn't let it go. He'd listened to the recordings for hours, headphones jammed into his ears until the plastic edges bruised the skin. Sometimes he thought he heard something, a whisper, the scrape of nails. But mostly it was just the low, throbbing hum of the train rolling over iron tracks, until the night it wasn't. Terrence was alone, slumped in a corner seat of the last car, the train clattering southbound. His eyes felt heavy, darkness tugging at the edges of his vision like sleep's cruel little fingers. The scream hit him like a physical blow. It started as a distant wail, something so sharp and keening it made his skin prickle. But it grew louder, swelling until it filled the car, rattling the windows and making his teeth vibrate. It wasn't just sound. It was pain. Agony so pure it became a living thing, clawing at him with icy fingers. Terrence stumbled to his feet, flashlight trembling in his hand as he moved toward the back of the train. The scream didn't stop. It pulsed through the air, relentless and raw. And then he saw her, at the end of the last car, hunched in the darkness like something forgotten. Woman, her skin a deathly gray, the flesh clinging to her bones like it had been stretched too tight. She wore a tattered dress, the fabric soaked and clinging to her body as if she'd crawled from the river. But it was her face that twisted his guts into knots. Her eyes were gouged out, nothing but black pits leaking something thick and dark. Her mouth a gaping wound, split open from ear to ear. She lurched forward, arms reaching, her fingers curled into claws. Terrence felt his legs give out. His flashlight clattered to the floor, rolling away to cast frantic, sweeping arcs of light against the walls. The scream kept coming, tearing itself from her ruined throat with a force that seemed impossible. He clamped his hands over his ears, but it did nothing to block out the sound. It tunneled into his head, writhing in his brain like worms. Terrence collapsed, his own voice rising to join hers, the two of them screaming in the dark until the train finally lurched to a halt. When his fellow officers found him, he was curled, in the corner, hands shaking so badly he couldn't hold his badge. Ramirez tried talking to him, his voice a distant hum like a half-forgotten dream. They said Terrence was raving, babbling about the woman with the torn mouth and the empty eyes, about how she'd whispered to him through the scream, her voice, coiling around his brain like smoke. They never stop hearing her, he kept repeating. Once you've heard her, she's in you and she won't stop. He was committed to Bellevue 2 days later. Ramirez tried visiting once. Terrence had been strapped to a bed, his eyes wide and blank, his lips moving soundlessly. The doctor said he'd ruptured both eardrums. Something about the pressure of the scream. But Ramirez saw the scars Terrence had dug into his own skin, words scratched over and over, until they'd become infected and raw. Find her. The screams kept coming. New calls from passengers who swore they heard a woman's voice shrieking from somewhere beyond the flickering lights. Conductors who claimed to see something crawling along the platform, just at the edge of their vision. Ramirez quit the force 6 months later, moved upstate. But some nights, when he lay awake with the dark pressed against his chest like a stone, he could still hear her, a sound that wasn't meant to be heard by the living, a scream that never ended.